So there is a set of conditions that kill more people each year than malaria, TB and AIDS put together. And those conditions are all treated by simple surgery. And imagine you live in a place where your father could die of an obstructed hernia, or your child faced a lifetime of disability and pain from something as simple as a broken leg, or you had to watch your wife die in labour because you couldn't afford her caesarean section. So for 70% of the world's population, this is their reality. 5 out of 7 people in the world don't have access to safe anaesthesia and surgery. And imagine if you lived in one of these places and then you were hit by a disaster or a conflict. Well, I work as a consultant anaesthetist in Bristol, but for the last 10 years I've also had the amazing opportunity to work with Médecins Sans Frontières as a member of their emergency surgical team, responding to natural disasters such as earthquakes in Haiti and Nepal, and also conflicts in Libya, Gaza, Syria and Yemen. And I believe that safe anaesthesia, safe high quality anaesthesia should be available for everyone, even if you're in a disaster zone. Well, is that really possible? In areas where there's so much destruction of infrastructure, limited staff, or is that just a pipe dream? Well, what do I mean by safe anaesthesia? Well, I mean that you should receive early, rapid resuscitation and good preoperative assessment. You should get timely surgery using equipment, drugs and techniques that have been adapted for the environment and delivered by people trained in those techniques. And you should get meticulous post-operative care and great pain relief. Is it really possible? Well, I'd like to introduce you to Samira and her family. And I first met Samira in 2012. At the time I was working in Syria in a tiny field hospital. It was a converted 4-bedroom house just on the outskirts of Aleppo. And Samira had fled the centre of Aleppo with her family, and as was very common at the time, she was living with about 30 members of her extended family in a house with her grandparents in a village nearby to us. On the day in question, it was coming towards the end of the day, we were winding down, when all of a sudden a couple of cars and a van raced up to the house, horns blaring, and when we ran outside and opened up the van, it was full of injured children. And the relatives in the cars told us that the adults had been preparing dinner whilst the children were playing, and the village had come under rocket attack and all the children had been hit by shrapnel. My job as an anaesthetist was to run the resuscitation bay, which was in what had been the dining room of the house. And they brought me in a 14-year-old boy who'd suffered a shrapnel injury to his chest. And he had a tension pneumothorax, so that means he had air escaping from his lung, which was pressing on his heart and sending him into shock. We were able to insert a chest drain, rapidly relieve the pressure, and he quickly stabilised. And then our surgeon, Mike, who's at the bedside of the next bed, called out to me and said, "Rachel, I think we can save this one." And that was when I met Samira. And when I saw her, she was wrapped up tightly in a blanket. They'd already started some IV fluids, and she had a little sticker on her arm that told me they'd given antibiotics and some anti-tetanus as well. I couldn't really see what else was wrong with her until they unwrapped the blanket. When I say she probably had the most severe injuries of anybody I'd seen who was still alive. One of her legs had been blown off, the other one was pointing in the opposite direction, and she had a huge wound in her abdomen from which all of her intestines were escaping. And I was filled with uncertainty and questions. Could we really manage her in this tiny hospital? Did I personally have the skills to look after such a seriously injured child? Should we even attempt it? What about the other children? Did one of them need life-saving surgery immediately as well? We only had one operating theatre. And if they did they have a better chance of survival than this severely injured girl? So we went outside to the garden where our emergency doctor was evaluating the other 10 children. There was one little girl who'd lost an arm, but she was stable with a tourniquet and a pressure dressing. And the other children all had soft tissue injuries. They were all stable. And we decided that although a lot of them needed surgery, they were all safe enough that they could wait and we could go ahead with Samira's surgery. So I went through to our living room, which we converted into an operating theatre, and I prepared the equipment I'd need to manage her airway. I drew up the drugs that I'd need for the anaesthetic and to support her blood pressure. And Samira was brought in, and we quickly got her anaesthetised. And whilst the surgeon started, I carried on resuscitating her. And it was really massive surgery. Even taking a damage control approach, it took 3 hours, and she needed an above-knee amputation, debridement of some multiple severe wounds. She needed a splenectomy. We had to remove one kidney, some of her bowel, and she had to have a colostomy. And at the end of this, it took about another hour of resuscitating her before she was actually stable enough for me to wake her up. We had no choice but to wake her up. We didn't have intensive care. I took her back through to the dining room, to the resuscitation bay, where a nurse looked after her, continuously monitoring her, whilst I went and found the logistician and explained to him that I'd just worked out that this child was going to need oxygen for at least the next 24 hours. And that was going to give him a really big headache because he was going to have to run the generator continuously for at least 24 hours to provide us with oxygen, and we were pretty short of fuel. So I left that problem with him and went back to Samira. Over the next several weeks, she had multiple return trips back to theatre. She had nutritional supplements to help support her healing, and we were able to provide her with special painkillers to help with her phantom limb pain from her amputated leg. And finally, on day 20, she was well enough to go home. So, did Samira and her family receive safe, quality anaesthetic care? Well, I think they all received rapid resuscitation, those that needed it, and they received quick treatment in terms of antibiotics and pain relief. Did they get timely surgery? Well, Samira was into theatre within 30 minutes of arriving at the hospital. And the other children, although they were delayed, I think that it was fast enough surgery. They didn't have any negative effect on their outcome, having to wait for us to finish with Samira. Were we trained in the equipment, and did we have sufficient equipment? Yes, we did. And post-operatively, despite her severe injuries, she had very little in the way of serious complications, and I think that was down to the meticulous nursing care and the good pain relief she had. So I'd argue that I think, yes, she did receive good anaesthetic care. And why was that possible for her in such limited resources, such a limited situation? Well, were we just lucky? Well, if we were, and it is possible, then we were lucky on an awful lot of days because there were a lot of Samiras. And it would be nice to think that we were a particularly brilliant team, but I'm sad to say we weren't. There wasn't anything particularly special about our team. But we had three things. We had access, we had capacity, and we had education. We had enough access to bring supplies and staff to the hospital and for Samira and her family to get to us. We had enough capacity in terms of physical infrastructure, equipment and number of staff to manage 12 children at once, just. And we had enough education and experience at managing these types of injuries in this context. So these three things, access, capacity and education, are key. And unfortunately, in disaster response, these are also usually the three biggest problems. So if we look at the first problem, the problem of access, and I'd like to do this by just considering Médecins Sans Frontières' response to 4 different disasters, starting off with the Haiti earthquake in 2010. And really I'd say this was probably one of the best situations in terms of access. We already had staff and equipment on the ground at the time of the earthquake. There was immense political will to allow international teams in. The airport was open very quickly, and we had the geographical good fortune, if you like, that the airport was situated pretty much at the epicenter of the disaster. And as a result of that, we were able to set up a 100-bed hospital with 4 operating theatres, electricity, running water, and 100 international staff in 5 days. That's amazingly fast and a credit to the logisticians. But if you're waiting for 5 days for emergency surgery, that's still too long. If you compare it then to the situation with the Nepal earthquake last year, and here we had, again, immense political will to bring in outside teams. We didn't have any teams already on the ground in Nepal. We had an airport that opened quickly, but here geography wasn't on our side. So the airport was a long distance from the epicenter of the disaster. And that meant that we had to truck 34 tons of field hospital for 8 hours over roads that aren't good at the best of times, and after an earthquake were severely affected by landslides. And the effect of that was that it took 9 days to set up a hospital much smaller, 2 operating theatres, 20 beds, and about 40 international staff. If you look at the situation in conflict, it gets even worse. So in 2011, the city of Misrata in Libya was under siege, and we were asked to go and help. And we had political assent, if you like, from Gaddafi's government and from NATO. You can go, but they weren't going to do anything to enable us to get there. We couldn't get in by land because it was surrounded by very active front lines. We couldn't get in by air because NATO had a no-fly zone which they weren't going to relax for us. So the only route in was by sea, crossing the NATO blockade, which we were allowed to do, but it involved a 36-hour boat journey from Malta in a small fishing boat heading for a port that's frequently shut by shelling and mines. And the result of that was that it took 3 weeks to set up 1 operating theatre, 20 beds, and to have 12 international staff in place. And finally, the worst of all situations, Syria, where we've got political refusal to allow access. And here, all of our equipment and staff had to be smuggled in. And this was my bag. It had a few clothes in it, and then 2 enormous cold boxes full of drugs. Everything had to be carried across. And not surprisingly, it took a month to set up 1 operating theatre, 12 beds, and 7 international staff. So if you compare, it's the same organisation, it's the same type of massive needs in the populations that we're going to, but very different responses in terms of speed and size of what we can provide, purely due to access. What about the problem of capacity? Well, unfortunately, it's exactly those countries who have the lowest healthcare capacity that are most prone to disasters and conflict. And hospitals themselves are not immune to disaster. This was the MSF trauma hospital in Haiti after the earthquake. It was completely destroyed. And sadly, increasingly in conflict, we're seeing that healthcare structures are targeted. So this is the MSF hospital, or was, in Kunduz, Afghanistan, which was destroyed by bombing last year. So just at the point when you need extra surgical capacity, you need massive increase in it, you're actually seeing it destroyed. And finally, education. Well, you may be lucky, as in Libya, we'd had local specialist anaesthetists and surgeons, but just because you're a specialist, it doesn't mean that you know how to manage patients well for earthquake or war injuries. And the same's equally true for those anaesthetists and specialists who volunteer for disaster response. We also have that knowledge and skill gap about managing patients for war injuries and disaster. In addition, we're used to working in high-tech, well-resourced environments. So when we go out and we face this sort of situation, unfamiliar drugs, limited equipment, different techniques, we also need training for that. And we've got the additional challenges of working in an unfamiliar culture, and often in a different language, or working through translators. So education is really important. So what can we do about these 3 problems of access, capacity, and education? Well, access is a really tricky one. As we've seen, it's mainly a function of geography, which obviously we can't change, and political will in the case of conflict, which unfortunately I don't think is likely to change anytime soon. So the main way to get around the problem of access is to capacity build. And why does that help? Well, if you can build capacity in the countries that are prone to disasters and conflicts, then the size of the international response and the speed at which it needs to arrive is much reduced, and the issue of access is much less of a problem. So how can we capacity build? Well, we can capacity build at many different levels. So the Royal College of Anaesthetists, through its work with the World Federation of Societies of Anesthesiologists and the G4 Alliance, advocate for safe surgery and anaesthesia. And there's been a lot of progress in the last couple of years. Safe surgery and anaesthesia is now part of the Global Health Development Goals for the World Health Organization. And that's the first time that we've got safe surgery and anaesthesia on a global health agenda. So there's a signed up commitment by countries, but we've got to keep the pressure on in order to translate that into action. We can help at the level of our hospitals. So we can bring overseas trainees to our hospitals as part of the medical training initiative. We can set up educational links with overseas hospitals, and we can support our own trainees in undertaking high quality global anaesthesia fellowships like the Lifebox Fellowship, the SAFE Fellowship. And at an individual level, there's loads that you can do. So if you've got the time and a very understanding family, then you can volunteer for disaster response. But if you're going to do that, I would plead with you that you sign up with an organisation that has an accredited emergency surgical team, registered and accredited by the World Health Organization. So you don't go out with a bunch of cowboys. If you don't have so much time, then you can go out and teach for a few days at a time, and a couple of really fantastic teaching programs are the Safe Anaesthesia from Education and Primary Trauma Care. And what I really like about those programs is that they incorporate training the trainers for local staff, so that when the international teams leave, those programs can be rolled out across the country by local trainers. And if you're not medical, or if you don't have the time to go away, then you can still help. You can join the Safe T Network, which brings together individuals, industry and organisations in order to drive safer anaesthesia and surgery programs. Or you can join the Not a Target campaign, which lobbies the United Nations and governments to respect international humanitarian law and protect healthcare workers in conflict. So it's possible to do lots. So in summary, I would say there's been a lot of progress. There's a lot more to go in terms of improving access and capacity and education for safe anaesthesia. But I do believe that if we continue to coordinate our efforts, both at an individual and an organisational level, then safe anaesthesia for everyone is possible, can be a reality, even in disaster zones. Thank you.